The cowboy helped a forgotten Apache woman. 15 years later, she returned with an army of warriors. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In the vast wilderness of the American West, a cowboy named Jacob lived alone, far away from civilization. His small ranch sat at the foot of the mountains, a place where the only sounds were the calls of the wind and the rustling of the tall grass. Jacob had made this remote part of the world his home after a series of personal losses. The passing of his wife, followed by the untimely death of his son, had left him feeling isolated and alone. His days were spent tending to the cattle and working the land, while the nights were filled with the silence of a home that no longer echoed with laughter or warmth. Jacob had no one to share his life with, and he had grown accustomed to the solitude, though a part of him always longed for the connection he had lost. One cold winter's night, as Jacob was finishing his chores, he heard a faint sound in the distance. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then the sound grew louder, closer. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow. Jacob's heart raced as he scanned the horizon, unsure of who or what was approaching. He wasn't used to visitors, especially not out here, where the nearest town was days away by horseback. Suddenly, through the snowfall, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her clothing tattered and her face pale from exhaustion. She stumbled forward, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. Jacob's instincts kicked in. He rushed to her side, offering his arm to steady her. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft and reassuring. The woman, though frightened, managed a weak smile as she clutched his arm for support. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're coming for me." Jacob looked around, his senses alert. He had no idea who they were, but one thing was clear. This woman needed help. He quickly led her inside his cabin, offering her food and warmth as the storm raged outside. Over the course of the evening, she told him her story. Her name was Talia, and she was a member of the Apache tribe. Her village had been attacked, and she had barely escaped with her life. Jacob listened quietly, offering her comfort and shelter, knowing that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. He offered her a bed by the fire, and as she slept, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was no mere coincidence. Little did Jacob know, this simple act of kindness would set into motion a chain of events that would alter the course of his life forever. As the storm howled outside, Jacob wondered what lay ahead. Would he be able to keep Talia safe? And what did she mean when she said, "They're coming for me"? The night passed in uneasy silence, and as dawn broke, Jacob knew that he could not remain neutral in the battle that was coming. His life was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting someone who had come to him in a time of need. As he stepped out into the cold morning air, he made a silent vow to help her, no matter the cost. But neither Jacob nor Talia could have foreseen the consequences of that decision. Jacob sat at the small wooden table, staring into the flickering flames of the fire. The warmth from the hearth was comforting, but his thoughts were consumed with the woman who lay on the bed in the corner of the room. Talia. Her story had rattled him, and despite his best efforts to focus on the present, the fear in her eyes still haunted him. She had spoken of her village being destroyed, of the brutal attack that had forced her to flee with only the clothes on her back. The desperation in her voice was something Jacob couldn't shake. He had known loss, he had known pain, but never in his life had he imagined the kind of violence she had experienced. He shook his head and stood up, walking to the window. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the world outside in a thick, cold silence. He couldn't understand why she had come to him, why she had sought shelter in his cabin when there were so many others she could have gone to. But there was no denying it now. His life, his quiet existence, was no longer his own. It was hers too. He had made a promise, a silent vow, to protect her, and he would see it through, no matter what. He turned away from the window and went back to his small table, picking up his rifle. The sound of the wind howling outside was unsettling, but he knew it wasn't the storm he needed to worry about. It was what was coming. Talia had been clear when she said, "They're coming for me." Jacob had no idea who they were, but he had a feeling he would soon find out. His mind raced as he tried to plan for the unknown. What kind of danger were they facing? How could he protect her if the threat was too great? He knew he couldn't do it alone. He had never been a man to rely on others, but now he was forced to consider that he might need help. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. For years, he had lived in isolation, choosing solitude over the mess of human interaction. But now, for the first time in a long while, he needed something from the world beyond his cabin walls. As the night wore on, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. He had offered Talia shelter, but what would happen when the men she had spoken of arrived? Would they come looking for her in the dead of night, in the snow, under the cover of the storm? Or would they wait until morning, when they could track her more easily? He had no answers, only the fear of what was to come. In the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn began to break, Jacob heard it. The faint sound of hooves in the distance. He froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was coming, and they were coming fast. His heart began to race. He grabbed his rifle, his fingers trembling as he checked the window once more. His breath caught in his throat as he saw them. Riders, several of them, cutting through the snow toward his cabin. He couldn't see their faces, but the way they moved, so quickly, so decisively, told him everything he needed to know. These were no ordinary travelers. They were hunters, and they had come for Talia. He turned quickly, glancing toward the bed where Talia slept, unaware of the danger approaching. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that the danger she had run from had found her. Jacob moved swiftly, grabbing his coat and pulling it on. He didn't know if he was ready for what was about to unfold, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let these men harm her. He had made a promise. The sound of the hooves grew louder, and Jacob stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. His breath formed clouds in the air as he scanned the landscape, his rifle at the ready. He knew he had to act quickly. There was no time to waste. As the riders drew closer, Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He could see them now, 5 men, all armed, all riding hard. Their horses were powerful, their faces grim. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle, and he took a deep breath. He had to make a stand. Talia's life depended on it. The riders came to a halt just outside his cabin. Jacob stood tall, his rifle aimed at the ground, but ready for anything. One of the men, the leader by the look of it, dismounted first. His dark eyes scanned the area before locking onto Jacob. "You've got something that belongs to us," the man said, his voice low and menacing. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He didn't have to ask. He knew exactly who they were looking for. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jacob replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smirked, a cold, calculating look in his eyes. "Don't play coy, cowboy. We know she's here, and we're not leaving without her." The tension in the air was thick. Jacob's pulse raced as he realized just how close the danger was. The woman he had helped, Talia, was no longer just a victim. She had become the focal point of something much larger. The battle for her freedom was about to begin. Jacob stood his ground, his rifle steady in his hands as the leader of the riders advanced. The 5 men had stopped just outside his cabin, their horses stamping in the snow, their faces shadowed by the hoods of their coats. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let his fear show. He had promised Talia's safety, and he wasn't about to let that promise be broken now. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down the left side of his face, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "We know she's here, cowboy," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You can either hand her over, or we'll take her by force." Jacob's jaw tightened. He had seen men like this before, men who were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. But this time, things were different. He wasn't going to let them have Talia. "She's not here," Jacob said, his voice firm. The leader's eyes flicked over Jacob's shoulder, scanning the cabin. "You're lying," he growled. "We've been tracking her for days. We know she came this way, and if you're hiding her, you're going to regret it." Jacob kept his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. He wasn't a man who liked to kill, but he would if it meant protecting Talia. "I don't want any trouble," Jacob said, his voice calm but edged with resolve. "But if you think you can take her, you're wrong." The leader sneered and took a step closer, his hand hovering near his gun. "You're not in control here, cowboy. We are." With a swift motion, The leader drew his weapon, aiming it at Jacob. But before he could pull the trigger, the sharp sound of hooves reached their ears. The riders froze, looking toward the horizon. The sound grew louder, closer, until the snow parted and another figure appeared. Jacob's heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. It was Talia. She was riding a horse, her face determined, her posture strong. She had come for him. The riders stepped back in shock, their eyes wide as Talia dismounted and walked toward Jacob. Her gaze was unwavering, and there was a strength in her that Jacob hadn't seen before. "I told you I would return," she said, her voice calm but full of authority. The leader of the riders looked at her, confusion and anger in his eyes. "You," he started, but Talia cut him off. "I'm not the woman you remember," she said, her voice firm. "I am the chief of my people now, and you will not take me or anyone from my tribe again." Jacob could see the shift in the leader's expression. He had underestimated Talia, just as Jacob had once done. But now, she was no longer the frightened woman who had sought refuge in his cabin. She was a leader, a warrior, and she would fight to protect her people. The leader took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously between Talia and Jacob. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this, all of you." Talia stood her ground, her eyes cold and unwavering. "You have no power here," she said. "Leave now, or face the consequences." The leader hesitated for a moment, then turned and signaled to his men. The riders mounted their horses and slowly began to ride away, their faces filled with anger and resentment. But Talia didn't move, her gaze locked on them as they disappeared into the distance. Jacob stood beside her, his heart still racing. He had never imagined this moment, this transformation of Talia from a helpless woman to a fierce leader. But as he looked at her, he knew that things would never be the same again. Talia had returned, not just to repay the kindness he had shown her, but to reclaim her power and to protect the people she loved. "Thank you," Jacob said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. Talia turned to him, her eyes softening for a moment. "You saved me once," she replied. "Now, it's my turn to protect you." The weight of her words settled over Jacob like a blanket, and for the first time in years, he felt hope. They stood there for a moment, in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, knowing that their lives had changed forever. The bond between them had shifted from one of simple gratitude to something deeper, something that could not be broken. Jacob knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more enemies, and more dangers. But with Talia by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with tension, but also a sense of purpose. Jacob and Talia worked together to prepare for what they both knew was coming. Talia's arrival had changed everything. She wasn't just a woman in need of protection anymore. She was a force, a leader with the strength and determination to face the enemies that had threatened her people. Jacob watched her with growing respect, but also with a sense of wonder. She had taken control of her fate in a way he had never imagined. Now, she was taking control of his fate too. They had spent the past few days fortifying the cabin, gathering supplies, and keeping watch for any signs of danger. Jacob had always been a man who preferred solitude, but now, with Talia by his side, he found himself fighting for something bigger than himself. As nightfall descended on the cabin once again, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. Talia had gathered her warriors, and they were preparing to move out at first light. The battle for her people's survival was far from over. The morning would bring a new challenge, one that would test everything they had worked for. That night, as the wind howled outside, Talia sat by the fire, her eyes distant. Jacob could see the weight of her responsibilities in the way she held herself. She was a leader, but at times, he saw the same fear in her that had been in his own eyes when he had first lost his family. "What's on your mind?" Jacob asked, breaking the silence. Talia looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I have to return to my people," she said quietly. "I can't keep hiding here. I've already cost you too much." Jacob shook his head. "You haven't cost me anything," he said firmly. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed. Hope." Talia smiled softly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hope isn't enough," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "We're facing an enemy that won't stop until we're all wiped out. They have more men, more resources, more power. I'm not sure we can win this fight." Jacob sat down next to her, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. He had seen the fear in her eyes, but he had also seen her strength. He had seen the way she had faced down the riders, the way she had stood tall when everything seemed impossible. "We don't have to win," Jacob said, his voice steady. "We just have to make sure they know we're not going down without a fight." Talia looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're willing to risk everything for me?" she asked softly. Jacob met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm willing to risk everything for what's right," he said, his voice resolute. Talia studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we fight," she said, her voice filled with determination. The next morning, the sun rose over the snow-covered landscape, casting a golden glow over the world. Jacob and Talia mounted their horses, the sound of hooves echoing in the quiet morning air. Behind them, a small group of Apache warriors had gathered, ready to face whatever came their way. They rode out, their hearts heavy with the weight of the battle that awaited them, but also filled with a sense of unity and purpose. As they approached the clearing where they knew the enemy would be waiting, Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain, he was no longer alone. Talia had brought him back to life, given him a reason to fight. Now, they would fight together. As they rode into the fray, Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle, and he steeled himself for whatever came next. The battle for survival had begun, and it was one they could not afford to lose. The battle was fierce. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the first shots rang out. The Apache warriors, led by Talia, moved with precision and speed, their horses charging across the snow-covered ground. Jacob was right behind her, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes focused on the enemy ahead. The enemy, a group of heavily armed mercenaries, had set up camp in the clearing, and they were ready for a fight. Jacob had no doubt that they were outnumbered, but he had one thing the enemy didn't: resolve. Talia's warriors fought with a strength and determination that made up for their smaller numbers. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a future. Jacob could see the fire in Talia's eyes as she led her warriors into battle, her voice ringing out with commands. Her courage was contagious. As the mercenaries fired their weapons, Jacob ducked behind a tree, his mind racing. He knew this would be a long fight, but he also knew that the longer they fought, the more their chances of winning would grow. Talia had led him into this fight, and now it was his turn to stand by her side. He fired, taking out one of the mercenaries who had been aiming at Talia. He could hear the sound of horses and men shouting, the chaos of battle all around him. But through it all, he kept his focus, knowing that if he lost sight of his goal, everything they had fought for would be lost. Talia was at the center of the fight, leading her warriors with a strength Jacob had never seen in anyone. She was relentless, fearless, and unstoppable. As she cut down one of the mercenaries with a swift motion, Jacob felt a surge of admiration for her. This woman, who had once been a refugee in his cabin, had become a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't just protecting her anymore, he was fighting alongside her. The battle raged on for hours, the sound of gunfire and the clash of swords echoing through the cold air. Jacob was beginning to feel the weight of the fight. His arms ached, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The enemy was beginning to retreat, their numbers thinning as the Apache warriors pushed forward. But Jacob knew the battle wasn't over yet. The mercenary leader, a tall man with a scar running down his face, had been watching from the back of the battlefield. Jacob spotted him, his eyes locking with the man's. It was clear that the leader wasn't going to give up easily. The leader's eyes were full of rage as he climbed onto his horse, spurring it forward. He had made it personal. He wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting for revenge. Jacob could see the man charging toward him, his sword drawn and ready. Without thinking, Jacob raised his rifle and fired. The bullet hit the leader in the chest, knocking him off his horse. The mercenary leader crumpled to the ground, his face contorted in pain. The battle slowed, the remaining mercenaries beginning to retreat as their leader fell. The Apache warriors, bloodied but triumphant, cheered as they pressed forward, securing their victory. Jacob lowered his rifle, his breath heavy, his heart still racing. The fight had been brutal, but they had won. He looked over at Talia, who was standing among her warriors, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She had done it. She had led them to victory. Talia caught his eye and smiled, a look of gratitude in her eyes. Jacob knew that this was just the beginning. The battle they had fought today was only one of many that would follow. But for now, they had won, and that was enough. Jacob walked toward Talia, his legs heavy with fatigue, but his spirit lifted by the triumph they had achieved. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse but full of pride. Talia nodded, her expression serious but grateful. "We did," she said softly. "But we still have work to do." Jacob looked out over the battlefield, the snow slowly beginning to cover the bodies of the fallen mercenaries. He knew Talia was right. This battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but they had each other. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The days following the battle were filled with both triumph and uncertainty. Jacob and Talia stood victorious, but the victory had come at a cost. The snow-covered ground around them was littered with the fallen, both Apache warriors and mercenaries. As the wounded were tended to, Jacob found himself looking over the battlefield, his thoughts heavy. The fight had been brutal, but they had held their ground. Talia had led her people to victory, but the war was far from over. Jacob knew this was just one battle in a much larger war, and the enemy wouldn't rest. They would return, and when they did, the stakes would be higher. Talia stood beside him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and pride. She had fought with everything she had, and now, with the battle won, she was focused on the future. "We need to move quickly," she said, her voice steady despite the weariness in her eyes. "This won't be the last time they come for us." Jacob nodded, his gaze never leaving her. He had seen the strength in her, the way she led her warriors with unwavering determination. He had fought by her side, and he would continue to do so, no matter the cost. "What's our next move?" he asked, his voice low. "We regroup," Talia said. "We need to gather more supplies, and we need to find allies. This isn't a fight we can win alone." Jacob knew she was right. They had won today, but the enemy was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had wiped out the Apache people. It was time to expand their efforts, to forge new alliances that could help them in the battles to come. As the sun set on the battlefield, Talia began to give orders to her warriors. They would bury their dead, tend to the wounded, and then prepare for the next phase of the war. Jacob watched her move with authority, her presence commanding the respect of everyone around her. In that moment, he realized just how much she had changed. The woman he had once sheltered was now a fierce leader, a force of nature. She had grown stronger with every challenge, and he had been by her side through it all. As the warriors began to prepare for the journey ahead, Jacob felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. He had lost so much in his life, his family, his peace. But with Talia, he had found something worth fighting for. Together, they would face whatever came next. The next few days were spent preparing for the journey. Jacob and Talia worked together to gather supplies, fix weapons, and strategize. Talia's warriors were a skilled and determined group, and they moved quickly to ensure they were ready for whatever the enemy might throw at them. But Jacob knew the time for preparation was running out. They had to act fast before the enemy could regroup and strike again. On the third day after the battle, as Jacob stood watch near the edge of the camp, he spotted a small group of riders approaching in the distance. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figures, Apache scouts, coming in from the front lines. They had news. Talia's face grew serious as she met with the scouts, and Jacob could see the tension in her body language. She listened intently as the scouts reported the movements of the enemy, detailing their efforts to regroup and plan for another attack. The mercenaries were not done with them. They were gathering more men, recruiting others from nearby towns and settlements, and preparing to return. In force, Talia took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We'll hit them before they have a chance to regroup," she said, her voice calm but fierce. Jacob didn't hesitate. He knew what she was about to say next. "We take the fight to them." With that, the decision was made. The Apache warriors would ride out at dawn, leaving their camp behind and taking the fight directly to the enemy's stronghold. Jacob was ready. He had no idea what awaited them, but he knew one thing. He would ride with Talia, and they would fight together. The night before the raid, Jacob stood alone outside the camp, looking up at the stars. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he didn't feel it. His thoughts were with Talia and the warriors. Tomorrow, they would ride into battle again, But this time, it would be different. This time, they would take the fight to the enemy. Jacob had never been a man of many words, but as he stood there, he whispered a silent vow. He would protect Talia, no matter the cost. She had given him a reason to live, a reason to fight. And now, he would stand beside her, as she had stood beside him, through whatever came next. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, Jacob mounted his horse and joined Talia and the warriors. Together, they rode into the unknown, ready to face the enemy head-on. The battle for their future was far from over, but they were no longer fighting alone. The ride toward the enemy's stronghold was long and grueling. Jacob and Talia, along with the Apache warriors, pressed forward, their horses moving at a steady pace through the snow-covered terrain. The air was cold, but the fire inside them was even colder, the need for revenge, for justice, for survival. Jacob had never been one to enjoy fighting, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about defending their lives. It was about taking back what was rightfully theirs and preventing the enemy from ever harming them again. Talia rode at the front, her posture straight and proud. She had become a true leader, not just in title, but in spirit. Jacob could see it in the way she moved, the way she commanded the respect of her warriors. She had once been a woman seeking refuge in his cabin, but now she was the chief of a people who had suffered so much and fought so hard. As they rode, Jacob's mind drifted back to the first time he had met her, the first time he had made the decision to help her. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness would lead to this moment, this battle. He had no idea that Talia would become the woman who would lead them all into this fight. But now, as he looked at her, he realized that she was no longer just someone he had saved. She had become his equal, his partner, and together, they would face whatever came next. As the day wore on, the terrain began to change. The flat, snow-covered plains gave way to hills and rocky outcroppings. Jacob could see that they were drawing closer to the enemy's stronghold. It was a fort, an old outpost that had been abandoned years ago and reclaimed by the mercenaries. It stood at the base of a mountain, its walls built from stone and timber. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, and Jacob could feel the tension building in the air. They were close now. As they neared the fort, Talia signaled for the group to halt. She turned to Jacob, her eyes intense and focused. "We move in quietly," she said, her voice low but firm. "We take them by surprise." Jacob nodded. He had been in many battles, but this one felt different. This time, they had the element of surprise on their side. The enemy wouldn't expect them to strike so quickly. The Apache warriors dismounted, their movements fluid and quiet as they prepared for the attack. Jacob could see the determination in their eyes. These men and women had lived through the same hardships, the same oppression, and now, they were ready to fight for their freedom. They were no longer victims. They were warriors. As the last light of the day faded, the Apache warriors moved into position. Jacob and Talia remained at the back, their eyes scanning the fort, looking for any signs of movement. They waited in the cold, the silence around them broken only by the sound of the wind. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Talia gave the signal, and the warriors sprang into action. They moved swiftly and silently, scaling the walls of the fort and slipping through the shadows. Jacob followed close behind, his rifle in hand. He could hear the sounds of the enemy inside, the murmur of voices and the clink of metal. The mercenaries had no idea what was coming. As they reached the gates of the fort, Talia's voice rang out in the night. "For the Apache," she shouted, her words echoing in the cold air. With that, the battle began. The Apache warriors stormed the gates, their arrows flying through the air, their swords cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Jacob fought alongside them, his rifle firing as he picked off mercenaries one by one. The chaos of the battle was deafening, the sounds of clashing steel and shouting voices filling the air. Jacob's heart raced as he moved through the fray, his focus on the enemy in front of him. He didn't know how long they fought. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. All he knew was that they couldn't stop. They couldn't give up. As the mercenaries began to retreat, Jacob saw Talia at the front of the battle, her sword raised high as she led the charge. Her warriors followed her, their strength and courage undeniable. In that moment, Jacob knew that they had won. The enemy had been defeated. but the victory was bittersweet. Jacob looked around at the bodies of the fallen, the warriors who had given their lives for this fight. He could feel the weight of the cost of war. It wasn't just the blood that was spilled, it was the lives that had been lost, the families that had been torn apart. Talia stood beside him, her face marked with exhaustion but also with pride. She had led them to victory, but the cost was clear. "We did it," Jacob said quietly, his voice filled with both relief and sorrow. Talia nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "We did," she said softly. "But the fight is far from over." Jacob looked out over the battlefield, his mind racing. There would be more battles, more struggles, and more sacrifices. But for the first time in a long while, he felt that there was hope. Together, he and Talia would face whatever came next. They would fight for their people, for their future, and they would never back down. The days after the battle were a blur of recovery, rebuilding, and preparation. Jacob and Talia had fought hard for their victory, but there was no time to rest. The war wasn't over, and the enemy was still out there, watching, waiting. Jacob knew that the moment they had seized was fleeting. The world around them was still dangerous, and more threats would come. He could see it in Talia's eyes as she moved with determination, coordinating the warriors and planning their next move. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The mercenaries they had fought weren't the only enemies they would face. The entire region was filled with people who saw the Apache as little more than a threat to be eliminated. But Jacob also knew that Talia was no longer the woman he had met in his cabin so many months ago. She had transformed into a leader, someone capable of inspiring not just her people, but Jacob himself. Her strength was undeniable, and it was that strength that kept them all moving forward. As the days passed, Jacob and Talia worked tirelessly to ensure the safety of the Apache tribe. They gathered what little supplies they could find, spoke with allies, and made sure their defenses were in place. The fort that had once been the enemy's stronghold was now theirs, and it would serve as their base of operations. But as much as Jacob wanted to focus on the victories, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. The fight had been won, but the cost was high. His body ached from the wounds he had sustained, and the faces of the fallen mercenaries haunted his thoughts. Talia had not said much about the cost of the battle, but Jacob could see it in her eyes. She was carrying the weight of the tribe's survival on her shoulders, and it was taking its toll. One evening, as the sun began to set and the fire crackled in the center of the camp, Jacob approached Talia. She was sitting on a rock, her sword resting beside her, looking out at the horizon. "You're thinking about what comes next, aren't you?" Jacob asked, his voice soft. Talia didn't turn to face him, but nodded slowly. "The battle we fought was just one step," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "There's more to be done, more battles to win, more people to save." Jacob sat beside her, feeling the weight of her words. "I know," he said quietly, "but we've done what we can for now. We've secured this place. We've given the tribe a chance to breathe." Talia sighed, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It's not enough," she said. "The enemy will regroup, and we'll have to face them again. And next time, they won't be caught off guard." Jacob placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the comfort he could. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice filled with resolve. Talia finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "I don't want to lose anyone else," she said softly. "I don't want to see my people suffer any more than they already have." Jacob's heart went out to her. He knew what she had been through, the losses she had endured, and he knew that she carried those scars with her every day. "We won't lose anyone else," he said, his voice firm. "Not while we have each other. Not while we have this tribe." Talia looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "I hope you're right," she said softly. The next few days were spent in preparation. Talia and Jacob gathered their warriors and began to form a strategy. They knew that the enemy was regrouping, but they also knew they couldn't wait for them to strike first. The Apache had always been fighters, and now they would fight for their future. As the warriors trained and the fort was fortified, Jacob found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. He had never imagined that his life would turn out this way, that he would become part of something bigger than himself. But with Talia by his side, he had found a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. The morning they were to set out for the next confrontation, Jacob stood at the edge of the camp, looking out at the land they had fought so hard to defend. The sun was rising, casting a warm light over the snow-covered plains. It felt like a new beginning. "We're ready," Talia said as she approached him, her voice steady and confident. "We'll take the fight to them. We won't stop until we've secured our place in this land." Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of her words. This was it. This was the moment they had been working toward. The war was far from over, but they had the strength to see it through. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would never back down. The final confrontation came sooner than Jacob had anticipated. The days of preparation, the strategy sessions, and the quiet tension had all led to this moment. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Jacob stood beside Talia and her warriors, ready for whatever would come next. They had been moving steadily towards the enemy's stronghold for several days, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. The sound of hooves on the ground echoed through the air, the rhythm of their advance steady and relentless. The Apache warriors were battle-hardened, but Jacob could sense the fear in the air. It wasn't just fear of the battle itself, it was fear of what would happen if they lost. Talia had led them this far, but now, it was up to them to finish what had been started. As they neared the stronghold, Jacob's thoughts turned inward. He had never imagined that his life would become this, fighting alongside a woman who had become a leader, a warrior, and a symbol of hope for her people. He had come to this place to protect her, but somewhere along the way, she had become the one to protect him. And now, they were standing together, united in their purpose. The stronghold was a fortress, built into the side of a mountain, its stone walls rising high into the sky. Jacob could see the flicker of torches inside, the faint sound of voices carrying on the wind. The enemy was waiting for them, but Jacob wasn't afraid. He had seen what Talia could do, what her people were capable of. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their future, for their right to live freely in the land that was rightfully theirs. Talia turned to Jacob, her eyes filled with determination. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "We take this fort, and we end this war." Jacob nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of the situation. There was no turning back now. They had come this far, and they would see it through to the end. As they prepared to move forward, Jacob caught sight of the mercenary leader, standing at the edge of the stronghold, his rifle aimed at the approaching warriors. The man's face was filled with hatred, his eyes burning with fury. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. This man had been the source of so much pain, so much loss. And now he would pay. The battle was swift and brutal. The Apache warriors stormed the stronghold, their weapons raised high as they clashed with the mercenaries. Jacob fought alongside them, his rifle firing with deadly precision. He could see Talia leading the charge, her sword cutting through the enemy with a fluidity that was both beautiful and terrifying. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Jacob couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he watched her. The mercenaries fought fiercely, but they were no match for the fury of the Apache warriors. One by one, they fell, their defenses crumbling under the weight of the attack. Jacob moved through the fray, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes focused on the leader of the mercenaries. He could see the man now, charging toward him, his sword raised high. But Jacob was ready. He fired, the shot echoing in the air, and the leader fell, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader fall, hesitated for a moment, and that was all the Apache warriors needed. With one final push, they overwhelmed the enemy, securing their victory. As the battle ended, Jacob stood amidst the chaos, his body covered in dirt and blood, but his heart filled with a sense of relief. They had done it. The stronghold was theirs. Talia appeared beside him, her face smeared with blood but her eyes shining with victory. She looked at Jacob, and for a moment, they simply stood there, taking in the enormity of what they had accomplished. "It's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. "It's over," he echoed. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew that the fight for their future wasn't truly over. There would always be battles to fight, struggles to overcome, and sacrifices to be made. But for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt that they had a chance. They had won this battle, and they would continue to fight together, side by side, for as long as it took. And with Talia by his side, Jacob knew they could face anything. The sun was setting on the battlefield, the last light of the day casting a golden glow over the land. It was a new beginning, a new chapter in their story. And as Jacob looked at Talia, he knew that together, they would write the next one.